Hello, everybody. My name is Anita Franco, and I'm here today to present a project that I and my colleagues, Shona Thompson and Katie Smythe, have recently undertaken to develop essential fish habitat maps for fish and shellfish species in Scotland. The aim of the project was to develop the evidence base for essential fish habitats to help the regulators, the Scottish Government in this case, in targeting future work towards informing consenting decisions for future planning and offshore wind project level assessments in Scottish waters. In this project, essential fish habitat was intended as a subset of the habitat occupied by a species, which supports key sensitive life stages and functions and has an added value through supporting higher abundance, enhanced survival, growth and production of these life stages. The essential fish habitat in these schematics is represented by C. In particular, in this project, habitat was intended as a combination of environmental and ecological conditions, both abiotic and biotic, and the structural components, for example, substratum and habitat types, which characterize an area. The essential fish habitat functions and the associated life stages that we considered included habitat used as refuge by all the individuals of a species, as a nursery by juveniles, or as spawning ground for adults at the spawning stage or where eggs are laid. The high density or aggregation of these individuals was used as an indicator of the essential fish habitat, thus reflecting its inherent added value. The study was conducted by applying two different approaches. On the left-hand side, you can see that where suitable data from fish surveys and environmental layers were available, and this was mainly in UK offshore waters, decision tree models were applied to predict the presence or absence of aggregations based on a set of associated environmental predictors. A confidence was associated with the model predictions by combining the statistical model performance with the confidence in the data used. On the right-hand side is the alternative approach that was applied where there were no sufficient data to support the modeling, and this was mainly in inshore waters. This was a habitat proxy approach, which used UNIS habitats as the spatial assessment units and was informed by a literature review and consultation with experts. A score was assigned to the habitat types based on how well they are likely to provide the essential fish habitat function for the species, and the confidence level was associated with it. This habitat proxy approach in particular was coordinated with a sister project undertaken for Natural England for English waters. The results of both assessments of the modelling and the habitat proxies were mapped, and the maps were subjected to validation through comparison with additional survey data and with the review provided by the experts. A total of 29 species were assessed between fish and shellfish. Here you can see a list of them with the indication of the essential fish habitat function that was assessed, the associated life stage considered, and how they were identified from the survey data. For example, for juveniles, body size and seasonality criteria were used. Here is an example of the maps that were obtained with the two approaches. On the left-hand side is the result of the modeling of juvenile aggregation of blue whiting, and on the right-hand side, the habitat proxies for juvenile sprat. There is not the time to go into much details, but I would like to highlight how the spatial outputs were generated so as to combine multiple layers of evidence shown as overlaid layers in the map. These included, of course, the predictions of the database models or the scoring for habitat proxy assessment as shown by the colored areas in the map, which also incorporate information about the associated confidence. In the example maps in particular, juvenile aggregation of blue whiting were mainly predicted based on depth, current and wave energy amongst other environmental variables, while the main UNIS habitat proxy for juvenile sprat on the right were well-mixed water column habitats, so pelagic habitats. An additional layer was given by survey data that show the actual distribution in the catches. These also included additional survey data that did not contribute to the modeling or the assessment and therefore are visualized as a way to validate the map predictions. Finally, the last layer included the feedback obtained from stakeholder validation in the form of polygons, which represent areas where there were discrepancies with the model results. For example, areas that are less or more important than what predicted according to the expert knowledge. Another objective of the project was to explore the possible implication of climate change for essential fish habitat. For this, the essential fish habitat models for some selected species, juvenile anglerfishes shown in the example, were applied to baseline environmental scenario, as in the map on the left-hand side. Maps for climate change projections of some key environmental predictors, for example, seabed temperature or change in depth due to sea level rise, were obtained from the NMPI for Scottish water, the NMPI portal, and these were applied to modify the baseline environmental scenario and therefore to observe the consequent change in the essential fish habitat model predictions as shown in the map on the right-hand side. In conclusion, this study allowed to move forward in the evidence-based understanding of the essential fish habitat distribution in UK inshore and offshore waters and the confidence associated with it. Compared to previous studies, it allowed to expand the spatial coverage of high-resolution essential fish habitat maps into Scottish and inshore waters and to assess species that were poorly covered in previous mappings, for example, shellfish species. Data and knowledge gaps were identified, and recommendations were provided on how to correctly use the spatial outputs produced, how to improve them through, for example, a more extensive stakeholder validation, and also how to improve the models and assessment behind the maps by filling the knowledge and data gaps and expand the survey database and UNIS habitats assessed to expand the geographical and species coverage and also to increase confidence. All of this will help the Scottish Government in targeting future work. I would like to conclude my presentation just with a special thank to the project steering group and the other external stakeholders who provided input throughout the project and during the map validation. Of course, thank you for your attention.
Hi there, I'm Jane Gordon. I'm a lead environment consultant at Xodus Group, and I'm going to be presenting on the good practice guidance for assessing fisheries displacement by other licensed marine activities. So just starting off with a bit of background, commercial fisheries displacement is a key stakeholder concern, and there was a real lack of research or guidance looking into displacement around marine renewable energy projects. And this led to the identification of the ScotMER evidence gap on the need for an accurate and validated method to predict fisheries displacement levels and locations. The good practice guidance and an associated literature review were produced to help address this gap by providing a standardised approach for assessing commercial fisheries displacement within an environmental impact assessment. And I've just listed the 3 objectives of the guidance on the screen there, and I'm going to go through how each of these were achieved. Starting with objective 1, which was to provide a clear definition for commercial fisheries displacement. The guidance broadly defines displacement as the relocation of fishing activity from one area into another as a result of an offshore development. However, the guidance goes one step further than that as well. It defines 2 levels of displacement, the first being primary displacement and the second being secondary displacement. And I'm just going to explain what those are and how they were defined in the guidance. So if you imagine that this blue circle here represents an area of fishing activity that overlaps with an offshore development, any displacement of effort from this area into another area is a direct result of the offshore development and is referred to as primary displacement. And if you imagine that this little green circle here represents fishing activity within the area in which those blue circle vessels have been displaced. The green circle vessels could experience increased competition, increased gear conflict, or maybe further displaced into another area. And this is an indirect effect of the offshore development. And that is referred to as secondary displacement. So that's the second level of displacement. And the definition of these 2 levels of displacement was really key in the guidance. A secondary displacement is a key stakeholder concern. Objective 2 was to provide standardised guidance for the sourcing, analysis and presentation of commercial fisheries data. Anybody that's been involved in a commercial fisheries impact assessment will know that a range of different data sources has to be used to inform the baseline. And it's really important that all those involved understand what the data sources are and what the limitations of them are. So to help achieve this, the guidance provides recommendations on the extent of the study area which should be used for the commercial fisheries baseline, a list of key data sources and how to access these, the limitations of the data sources, how to present the data, and also recommendations for consultation. And this is provided in a succinct and neat table, which should be a really good reference for people to look at. And importantly, this allows for an accurate identification of sensitive receptors, which is key for the commercial fisheries assessment. Moving on to the third objective, which was the main focus of the guidance, and this was to provide guidance and key points for consideration by developers, EIA practitioners and stakeholders relevant to the assessment of commercial fisheries displacement. So as I mentioned previously, the main application of the guidance is for use in environmental impact assessments. And it was considered really important that the guidance aligns with the EIA process so it can easily be slotted into the EIA. So recommendations for the guidance are provided on how to assign the sensitivity of a receptor to displacement and the magnitude of effect. And I've just listed on the slide there some of the key considerations for both of those aspects. So starting with sensitivity, the guidance provides a list of key vessel parameters that can influence the sensitivity to displacement. And this includes things that could affect the potential for coexistence with the offshore development, such as vessel size or minimum spatial operating requirements, and also things related to operating practices that can influence the vessel's adaptability or versatility in terms of target species. The guidance also provides recommendations on how to determine the availability of alternative grounds, as this is a key consideration when assigning the sensitivity of a receptor to displacement. And the guidance goes beyond just considering vessel size as a proxy for operational range. It recommends reviewing VMS data to understand the availability of established grounds for that fishing method in the area, and also considering any specific habitat types or sediment types that fishing method might require, as that will also influence the availability of alternative grounds. Moving on to magnitude, the good practice guidance provides a list of the key project parameters that should be reviewed when considering the spatial extent and duration of any displacement. And it also provides recommendations on how to determine the potential for increased conflict or increased competition to arise, including for secondary displacement impacts. So this includes things like how much displacement is likely to occur from the offshore development area and where those vessels are likely to be displaced to, whether that's across a wide area or whether it's across more localized areas which could increase the potential for gear conflict and competition. And once the sensitivity and magnitudes have been defined, the overall significance of any displacement effects can be determined, and proportionate mitigation can be identified if required. And importantly, the guidance provides a step-by-step process, which should allow for an accessible methodology to be employed in commercial fisheries impact assessments. So by achieving those three objectives, the guidance provides an accessible methodology that easily slots into an EIA, allowing for proportionate mitigation to be provided and for a more consistent and accurate assessment to be made. And this is really important considering the stakeholder concern around displacement impacts. But I definitely see this as the first step in improving the understanding of how to assess displacement. And there are future avenues of research, including monitoring how fishing activity changes around offshore developments, and also improving the understanding of factors that influence coexistence of offshore renewable developments and commercial fisheries. And I think improving our understanding on those two aspects can easily transfer into the guidance and improve our understanding and assessment of commercial fisheries displacement. That's all from me today, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Hello everyone, my name is Monica Fundingsland. I work as a Sustainability Advisor for Equinor, where I have a strategic environmental and consents role for offshore wind. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this symposium. I'm really pleased to be here and talk about the static fishing gear trials we've been undertaking at our Hywind, Scotland floating offshore wind farm. And I'm also very excited to be able to premiere a video we've made of these trials. But firstly, very briefly about Equinor. We have more than a decade experience with floating offshore wind, starting with our Hywind demo off the coast of Norway in 2009. And we have two floating offshore wind farms, Hywind Scotland, which I'm talking about today, and Hywind Tampen in Norway, which is the world's first floating wind farm to power offshore oil and gas fields. The background and context for these trials is essentially that whereas fishing is not prohibited within offshore wind farms in the UK, there's a perception that it's difficult to fish in a floating wind farm due to the underwater structures. At the same time, we know that offshore wind is a rapidly growing industry, and we see that there is a need to understand how best offshore wind can share the ocean space with fishers and other sea users. We see that there's a need for dialogue on how the fishing and offshore wind industries can find meaningful ways to work together and explore what coexistence could mean for both our industries. We decided to use our Hywind Scotland site to test whether certain types of static fishing gear can be safely deployed and retrieved inside the turbine area. And we've been delighted to partner with Marine Scotland Science on this, with Kirsty Wright, who's chairing this session as the project manager. Before I share the video, I want to briefly show what our Hywind Scotland floating offshore wind farm looks like. It's a commercial floating offshore wind farm. It's been operating since 2017. It has 5 6 megawatt turbines, so a total capacity of 30 megawatt. It has a high capacity factor with an average of 55% over the last 5 years. It has a steel spar substructure. Each turbine is attached to the seabed with 3 mooring lines and suction anchors, and it has partly suspended and partly buried inter-array cables between the turbines. You can see the red dotted lines there. It's located off the east coast of Scotland, 25 kilometres from shore, in water depths from 95 to 120 metres. So without further ado, I will now share the video with you.
We believe that it is possible for the offshore wind industry to share the ocean space with the fishing industry. So we're keen to better understand how we can coexist with local fishers with a particular focus on floating wind. Equinor decided to do these trials to understand whether it is possible to fish safely within the turbine area of a floating offshore wind farm.
We're currently in the Hywind floating offshore wind farm, which is the east coast of Scotland off of the coast of Peterhead. And this is the world's first floating offshore wind farm. The main aim of the project is to trial the safety of deploying the gear in a floating offshore wind farm.
The biggest challenge for us as a vessel is for the weather conditions when we get to the Hywind wind farm. We've got to keep an eye on these towers all the time. When we go here, we're hauling and shooting equipment. We've got to be safe at all times. The safety is priority number 1, you know, for everybody's to stay safe.
We're just here on the fishing deck, and this is where we've got all our gear stored. So down here we've got our prawn creels, and this is a fleet of 20. Then over here we've got our crab creels, and this is also a fleet of 20. On the lower deck we have 8 large fish traps. And over here we've got our electronic jiggers, and this is 3 jiggers, which you can see the guys are operating just now.
The idea is we have to go out and shoot these strings of equipment in certain areas within the wind farm to see where the concentrations of crab or fish or shellfish are within the wind farm itself.
We've undertaken monthly trips for a period of 5 months, from July to November, with each trip lasting about 4 to 5 days each.
We're doing a rotational fishing method around the different sites inside and outside of the wind farm, and we're deploying and hauling the different types of gear each day and moving on to the next area and so on. This is the standard way that we measure fish and shellfish, and then we're putting all of that data into the laptop and analysing that data. This insight will support considerations for good practice to promote coexistence between offshore wind farms and commercial fisheries. We have also collected biodiversity data inside and outside the wind farm to further our environmental knowledge of the wind farm and the surrounding areas.
This trial proves that under the right conditions and with the right information, it is possible to safely deploy and recover these types of fishing gear within a floating offshore wind farm. And we're hoping to expand the trials to also include other fishing methods in the future. These trials have given us valuable knowledge that we will be using in our projects all over the world.
As you heard on the video, the fishing methods we have tested include commercial fish traps, crab creels and electronic jiggers. The trials will also give us some information about the biodiversity in the area. and the study contributes to some of the evidence gaps identified through ScotMER. For the practical implementation of these trials, we hired a local fishing boat and crew as a dayboat charter, with Marine Scotland Science on board to undertake and document the trials. The gear was successfully deployed and retrieved within predefined areas with safe distances to the underwater structures, and there were no safety incidents and no snagging or loss of fishing gear. So the findings so far show that with the right information and under the right conditions, it is possible to fish safely within the turbine area of a floating offshore wind farm. In terms of the next steps, the video that you saw will be available on both the Equinor and Marine Scotland Science websites, and a report with analysed results and recommendations will be published by this summer. And we're hoping to expand the fishing trials to include other fishing methods in the future. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Angela Muench. I will present to you the project Fisheries Sensitivity Mapping and Displacement, a research project funded by the Crown Estate under the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme. The goal of the project is to identify fishing locations. So who's fishing where? How can they be displaced? Can they be displaced? Where are conflicts? Where are non-conflicts or low conflicts? And so this is important to provide as kind of evidence for the British Energy Security Strategy, but also 25 years plan, Fisheries Act, and so on. Just simply that we can better kind of accommodate fisheries and offshore wind farm in UK waters. This project is a joint project between St Andrews University, Cefas, and Marine Scotland Science. We are, however, supported by quite a lot of stakeholders from industry and policy. So, for example, we have quite a lot of people from the fisheries organization, but also from offshore wind farm like Ørsted or Ocean Winds. On policy side, we have DEFRA, MMO, GNCC, Natural England involved as well as the Crown Estate. This project is led by me. However, there are two main scientific components, work packages. One is work package 2, led by Tanja Mendo, who is fishing where, which is about developing methods on creating maps on fine steer fishing locations. Work package 3, it's me led, which is a kind of trying then to translate these fishing maps into sensitivity maps, checking and implementing a displacement modeling and defining constraint and opportunity for fishing industry and offshore wind farm. The results of the project will be compiled in a web tool, which is developed by St Andrews, so will be made publicly available after the end of the project. This project is a 2-year project, which just started September last year. So we had a kickoff meeting in St Andrews. We just started to do a review of data and methods. However, so we don't have any results yet to present. We will have a half-time meeting in September this year to start to present the first results. And we will have a final dissemination meeting in August 2024, which will be hosted by Cefas. As mentioned already, work package 2 is looking at who is fishing where, and is led by Tanja Mendo from University of St Andrews. The objective of this work package is to review existing data, method tools to identify the spatial distribution of fishing activities of vessels in the UK EZ. So this involves domestic vessels, but also international vessels. We also want to improve the methods of spatial representation of fishing activities. One of the first things we try to do is combining EIS and VMS data. This sounds pretty straightforward, pretty easy, but however, due to a lack of unique identifier between these different data sets, it's not as straightforward as you would hope for. First maps produced, you can see here. We can see this combining these both, if we are successful, we can add quite a lot of information to the information we're already having on vessel activity and identify better what is actually trawling activity or moving activity, what is fishing activity. Work package 3, led by me, is on the constraint on opportunity of combining fishing industry with offshore wind farm. This is more taking on the economic perspective. This work package has 3 objectives. One is converting the maps from Tanja produced in the work package 2 into what we call sensitivity maps, so which tells us which areas are of high conflict, which are low conflict areas. Task 2 is actually on case studies, testing displacement models we are already having developed and want to improve. And then the sites of these both tasks will be put together in task 3 on an economic impact assessment for the fishing sectors if we are introducing offshore wind farm. The sites of these two work packages will be made available to the public in a web tour. This work package is led by Mark James and Renee Swift. This work package's goal is to make all the maps we're creating in work package 2 and work package 3 to make them spatially explicit and available for the public, for stakeholders, but also for the public as such. There will be detailed consultation with the project partners, but also with the project advisory group and other stakeholders which are interested in this. The data structure will be developed by St. Andrews, however, it will be hosted then later by Cefas. As an example, how this web tour could be looking, this is an MPI, which is a Marine Scotland geospatial web tour. Here we can already see how we can do this, how we can implement filters, scale, etc., so on. So the idea is to have a similar web tour for those sides of the project. Thank you for your attention. If you have any further questions, please contact one of the partners as stated below.